My name is Sinead McBurty, and I'm the Chief Executive of Education Support. We're the charity hosting this webinar and series of webinars. We are very proud of the fact that we produce regular webinars in which we hear directly from practitioners, because there's nobody more expert in the work that you do than you. So it's really important to us to make a space available so that we can hear directly from educators on a variety of themes that affect the well-being of the workforce. I will say not a whole lot about education support because you can find out more about us from our website, but I will say we were set up in 1877 by teachers for teachers. So we have a long and esteemed history in this space. And we believe that better well-being leads to better outcomes in our schools. So that's really what we're all about, working directly with education staff, also with schools and colleges, and influencing policymakers to try and improve the situation that we have across the four nations for our education staff who are trying to do their very best for the children and young people that we serve. And this webinar is focused on our relationships with parents. We have produced, last week, we've issued the 2024 Teacher Wellbeing Index, which is our flagship research report. We produce it each year so that we can keep an eye on what's happening for the workforce, and also then hold that mirror up back to the sector and say, this is where our education workforce is, and these are some of the areas that we might need to begin to address to make a difference. We try and do that a little bit more forcefully than I've just described it, with a bit more heft and demand, but that's ultimately what we're about. And in this year's report, we asked educators about their experiences with parents. And we knew, because we hear from educators all the time, we talk to people routinely and work with colleagues across the whole of the United Kingdom. We weren't surprised to find that people experienced an increase in parents, in challenging interactions with parents. But what did surprise us was the extent of it. So in fact, 70% of the workforce reported that they had experienced challenging interactions with parents, and that then has a negative impact on their own mental health and well-being. So that's really the context for which we're coming to this conversation today. So if all of that sounds like not the room you're meant to be in, well, hang on anyway, it might be interesting. And I'm about to stop talking, which is definitely going to improve it. But let me introduce you to our fabulous panel first. I'm delighted to welcome Johnny Josephs, who is an assistant principal in South London. And just because I've been living in Brixton for 30 years doesn't mean I think South London's better than anywhere else in the country. I have a lot of love for everywhere, but I'm just saying, South London, it's nice to have you in. Johnny is, aside from being an assistant principal, is also co-founder of Black Men Teach. And through that work, he's aiming to build a space where Black men in education can thrive in their roles professionally. Also delighted to welcome Sarah Brown, who's an early years teacher. Sarah spent her career working in deprived inner city schools. She spends a good chunk of her time being a mentor to student and newbie teachers. And she's also very generous in sharing her experiences of being a teacher with dyslexia and talking about how that works for her and what she's learned. So really delighted to see Sarah back with us for, I think, her second time on one of our webinars. And finally, I'm super happy to welcome Adrian Rollins today. He is a head in Wolverhampton. And my children were most interested, actually, Adrian, in you when I told them that apart from being a passionate and experienced leader, this man's played professional cricket for 10 years. So you can work out which aspect of your CV was most appealing to my 14-year-old in your own time. But delighted to have this panel with us today to have this conversation. Just before we get stuck in, I also want to let you know that as well as being able to join in through the chat and post your questions on the Q&A, and please do, I also want to let you know that we have our helpline number, 08000 562 561, and a colleague will post that in the chat now as well. And I'm highlighting that because for some people on the call, it may be that the conversation around parents and difficult situations people have had with parents is, brings up something for you that is painful or difficult, or you've struggled with. And I want everybody to know that there is a listening ear on the other side of that phone. Our team is really well qualified. And we're there to have conversations about things that are difficult. So if you're feeling in any way affected by the conversation, know that there is help on the other end of that phone line immediately. Right. Now that that is done, let us get stuck in. And Adrian, I'm going to start with you, if I may. I wanted to start by asking you, from a leadership perspective, what do you think is good practice in terms of how we engage with our parents in our communities?
I think there's various ways you do that, but the most precious commodity I found as a leader is actually being available. So being available, and myself as head in all my SLT roles, I've not been an office-based leader, so I'm very much available. From a leadership point of view, for example, at my school we run things like parent surgeries, but also often go out into the community and go out and meet parents, because for some people the experience of school itself, from their own personal experience, they know, they have a real anxiety around even going to school, sending their children to school and going to school themselves. So making that time to meet parents outside of school. But I think it's really important. It's about the communication, whether it's either via letters or via newsletters or by phone. It's knowing that you're available and knowing that you're open, that your door's always open for that communication, and also being actually open to feedback, because parents know the community, parents know their children, and they know them often better than we do. And for us actually understanding that and taking that on board. And that's not just for those parents or pupils we send, but for all students.
Brilliant. And just a point of clarification there. When you talk about those parent surgeries that you hold, how does that work?
And essentially, what I do is, once a half term or sometimes twice half term, there's a booking system where parents can meet me, as opposed to, for example, if we have a parents' evening and I'm available, I'm often walking around the school and I might be meeting and greeting, but there's not that real opportunity to have that conversation. So from say around 3 o'clock till 6 o'clock, one evening and a half term, 1 or 2 evenings and a half term, parents can book 10 to 15 minutes with me and have conversations. And that framing is really clear. It's what they like best for their child. So taking those positives, what they'd like to improve, what they'd like from the school to improve, and also how we can work together, so the school and the parents, to make their child's experience of school as positive as possible, and also for them to get the best value education, a world-class education. But it's a two-way conversation, and it's not just often with the parents. Their child is welcome to come with them as well, so because we want them to be part of the conversation. So it's not a closed door, it's one where it's open, but it's what their child likes best, what would you like to improve, and how we can work together to improve their child's experience. Because sometimes it might be communication or understanding. A parent might say, my child has an EHCP hasn't arrived, not being aware that that's actually an LA communication tool. So therefore, then that's an opportunity for us as a school to understand how effective is our communication to help parents understand as much as they need to know about the education system. So it's taking that information, feeding back to staff and feeding back to leaders in the school, and then acting on it. So it's not just a case of them saying things, it's actually then acting on it and giving that feedback and then following up where necessary. And that includes the positives.
I really like how that's framed positively, because I think so often the conversations can start straight into something that's problematic or painful or challenging. So it's a very nice container, and lovely that you make that space available. Thanks a million, Adrian. Um, Sarah, I wanted to ask you about, from the classroom perspective as a teacher, what do you think is most important for teachers to be holding in mind when they're interacting with parents?
I think, following on from what Adrian said, it's really important to be mindful that you as an educator are there to educate children. And that, yes, we are seeing an increase in having to support and educate parents as well. And parents are expecting us as educators to take on more of a parenting role for their child, but reminding and supporting parents in that we as educators are here to help teach your child, but you as a parent also have that responsibility is really important. And I think by having a well-framed conversation around how a parent can support their child's development and how they can support their well-being and their for example, their toileting, because we know that is increasing with the amount of children that aren't coming into school toilet trained. By framing that in a way that actually says, you know what, yes, we're doing all these things, but you also need to do these things at home. It's really important. And I think, like Adrian said, as a head teacher in his school, he runs those surgeries, and he's very parent facing. You need a leadership team that are supportive, and if you have a leadership team that are there and are going to back you, and you come together with a policy that says, actually, by all means, yes, we are going to support our parents with parenting and with helping their child, but we're not going to do that for them. You can have really positive conversations with parents and get parents on board very easily. I think it's about the way it's framed and the way that you ensure that parents are empowered, because you are empowered as a teacher by your training. Parents are often not empowered because they go through many services, and many support networks often do things for them, or often take away their autonomy, because people are like, oh, I'll just do it for you. Oh, I'll do that EHCP for you. Oh, I'll write that SEND plan for you. Oh, I'll do that bill for you. Oh, I'll apply for those benefits for you. And so by the time they get to school, parents think that things are done for them. And we shouldn't be doing that, because we have already so much to do. So I think by having a strong policy in place and supporting your early years teachers, and all teachers, you know, whether it's in primary school, early years, or in secondary, as I'm sure John and I will come on to, there's lots of ways that as a school you can support them, but it's a whole school process. And I think teachers need to feel that backing from their leadership team too.
Yeah, I'm about to turn to John Oy on this point about backing from leadership teams. I think one of the interesting things I noticed about what both you and Adrian have talked about is being quite explicit about the joint responsibility that professionals hold with parents, and putting that into the mix. But it sounds, when you're both describing that, what I'm hearing is not in a kind of blamey way, but very much around the kind of opportunity that, what can be achieved when you work together. So that's sort of one of the things that's popping out for me there.
Yeah. Oh,
No,
can I?
yeah,
I was just going to say absolutely, and I think it is really important to bring parents on board with you, like Adrian said, have that as a positive frame conversation. So many times I sit in parent meetings, or I hear you know Senkos that I've worked with, or like earlier Senkos, and like from the local authority say, oh, the child's not doing this, the child's not doing that, the parent wants this. And actually it's about framing it towards the child is able to do A, B, C, D, E, F, G, but we really need or want them to be able to do H, I, J. What are we going to do to make those steps, and how are we going to frame that? Because every child is, a blessing, and that parents, own thing. And by all means, yes, parents do want a one-to-one for their child, or they do want their own thing for their child, and they're not always going to get it, because we have 30 children in each class.
yeah,
There's over 200 children in school. But by bringing parents on board with you and framing it in a positive way, even if for you as a teacher every day is really hard, and you have 15 SEN children in your cohort of 30, and it's really depleting, you do have a really, we do have a hard job. I completely understand that. But if you're framing it towards parents in a positive way, you're
yeah,
much more likely to get a positive response,
yeah,
because parents won't get their backs up. They won't feel that they have to defend themselves or their child. I've had lots of parents that have come to me that said, my child can't go to another school, or in other schools that I've worked in, or there's lots of things that parents have said, oh, actually, we can't manage this, or we can't manage that. And often I will say, we can, and we will,
yeah,
and we'll work
yeah,
with you and support you.
yeah. Lovely.
But I'm
Thank you.
sorry, I'll pick it very, very brief. I think it's just to add to that, what's parenting is hard, and I think as time goes on, it becomes harder and harder. The time when I grew up compared to growing up now, even with my own children, they're in their 20s, and compared to having children now or raising children now, for example, in a secondary setting, it is hard. The distractions are huge, um, and it can be difficult, and the cost of living and all those kind of factors that make parenting difficult. We got parents who leave their children to go to school and come back expecting their children to be home, and
Yeah,
the level of support that we give the parents is important. We're not taking away their parenting from them, but at the end of the day, it is hugely important that the difference we can make as that layer of support for parents.
Lovely, lovely, Adrian. And I think there's a lot in that. And we may come back to this that times have changed, and it feels like they've changed quite rapidly in some ways. But we'll pick this up. I want to come to Jonoy, and just ask you. So we heard from Adrian about what he thinks kind of good practice looks like, and we heard from Sarah about being in the classroom. In terms of leadership teams supporting staff, supporting frontline staff, what do you think is most important for leadership teams to be thinking about and how they ought to be behaving with their staff in order to be appropriately supportive?
So yeah, I was just jotting down something that just came to mind immediately. I'd say the first thing has to be about alignment. And what I mean by alignment is that you have to kind of trust your staff that they are echoing where you stand as a school towards certain issues, and that you trust them to communicate that. So if I was to be called into a meeting, I know that there should never be any form of cognitive dissonance between what my staff has said and what I will then say, because we're singing on the same hymn sheet. And if we truly believe that, then I think clarity is something that is very, very important when you are explaining certain policies. I think if staff trust and know that you will support them at all costs, and not to necessarily a detriment, but know that their back is supported. It does allow them to speak to parents and maneuver certain difficult conversations with confidence, knowing that the school is in support of them and that they don't need to act outside of character to kind of get certain points across, I would say the least. So yeah, those are the main two things: alignment, which obviously and clarifying certain things, having a clear policy towards certain things that can be communicated very clearly to parents. And if staff feel supported, then it makes your job a lot easier.
And Jono, if you and this you might need to take an imaginative leap for me here, but if staff are working in schools and they feel like the leadership team is not fully backing them up, how could they most effectively approach leaders to say, can we do this differently? Like what are some good ways to bring that conversation up, do you think?
I would say that that member of staff should use their school's forum to raise concerns. So we and if there's nothing very clear in terms of that, I would definitely suggest that they raise it via line management. And then hopefully the line management would then pass it on to the necessary individuals. But you need to use your school's forum. And I think some people tend to have this whole idea that I'll go jump forward then jump back. I've recently moved to an amazing school, right, in South London. I really, really love it here. I've I've embed quite a lot of things, new things. And I remember what my head teacher said is, just because you don't necessarily receive feedback doesn't necessarily mean that it's not out there. So I've had to be quite proactive with feedback. And I say that to say that as staff members, we almost need to be very, very explicit in terms of how we feedback what things that's currently happening within the school and communicate that. And if nothing's communicated, then nothing can be resolved at all. So that's the last thing I'll probably say regarding that.
Lovely. I always delight in hearing people say they work in a brilliant school. It makes me very happy. We often end up hearing about people who are not in such great places. So I'm always delighted to hear the contrary. And of course, you're right. And I know from my own experience as a leader, I can't do anything about something if I don't understand that it's an issue. That magic superpower failed me at the outset. So really important points there. Adrian, I want to come to this idea of challenging conversations, and I know you'll have had one or two in your time. I'm going to put a bet on there, in a very responsible way, obviously. But do you have any tips from your experience of things you've learned about having challenging conversations? And I'm going to ask you that as a school leader, and then I'm going to ask Sarah to think about that from the classroom perspective, because I think different types of conversations often the same, but also there's sort of it seems to me there's a little bit of difference sometimes in how they're approached, and the level of heat in them might also differ. So any tips that you have that you've learned on your journey?
For me, what I've learned in my experience is a challenging conversation is almost as challenging as you want to make it. Ultimately, the starting point is we're gonna have a conversation about your child and what we believe is best for your child, and that's in terms of both of myself and the parent, and then also line up with our expectations and expectations, not necessarily in school of working hard, but those expectations about positive relationships and respect, and those expectations. Then we can talk further about whether it's engagement with the curriculum or behaviour towards others. Ultimately, the start of the conversation is what we want to take away from this is what is best for the child. Now, when there might be a disconnect or a difficult conversation, for me, it's about from a leader's point of view, is actually remaining calm and composed and constantly returning to the key thing around what is best for the child and around expectations that you have of them, which you'd expect the parent to be aligned with those. Sometimes I've had conversations where, there's also a line has to be drawn. There's conversations about being respectful towards their child, being respectful towards staff, but also where you might have parents who are actually disrespectful to staff and to other people's children and things like that. And sometimes those difficult conversations have to go outside of the conversation you're having. So I've occasionally, not necessarily in this role, but in other places where we've had to do a Section 547 letter, but they're the extreme cases. But outside that, because there has to be a line that has to be drawn in terms of, we're going to have a conversation, but we're not going to have high volume or expletives or anything like that used, because we don't use that towards your child and you're not going to use that towards us. But at the same time, you will understand that they're parents and they want the best for the child, but that's not how we're going to communicate if we're going to get to a solution. So for me, if you hold that line, ultimately there will be a solution at the end. It may not be agreed, but there will be one at the end. But ultimately, it's around speaking about what's best for the child and speaking of what's best for other people's children in a school like, for example, mine, where we've got more than 1,000 children. It's about what's best for everybody and how their child doesn't have to be the same, because we're definitely not robotic, but what those basic expectations, and keep returning to those and not do that in a way that's aggressive, has to be non-aggressive and also non-judgmental. So we're talking about the child's behavior, not the child as in your child is this. And I think when you have those conversations, and that is how you manage those challenging conversations. But for me, they're not challenging, they're just common sense conversations around what is best for the child, what's best for them, and how we can actually support those parents to make sure their child does that. And if they don't follow those and not prepared to do that, then there's a different conversation. So they're as difficult as challenging as you want to make them. For me, they're just about interactions which are focused on what they expect of the child and what's best for the child.
What's very striking to me there is how clear you are, Adrian, about how you hold those, and the sort of the values that you hold emanate from how, your own clarity about how to have them. But it also seems very simple. You're not trying to hold a lot of complex, how do I do this in my head? You've got a really clean lines around having the conversation. And again, it comes back to quite a positive joint endeavor and trying to bring the parents on side. And it sounds as though, your experience is that sticking to that works. Like it's reliable.
Yeah, it helps. I think when my children have been through the system and you've identified what works for them and what's not worked, two of my children have SEND needs. And with that in mind, it's around, sometimes having that communication skill to understand that, and how sometimes that can be frustrating as a parent, even if they're undiagnosed SEND and even not trying to push for SEND, but having that conversation around understanding without making excuses for your children, which I've never made for mine. But having had my children go through the system, I know what I would like for them. So when I'm having conversations with parents, it's ultimately what that boils down to: what is best for that child in this environment, and not to veer away from it, not to stay away from it, or to talk about other people's children. Let's just come back to your child, talk about your child, their personal responsibility, and our joint responsibility in terms of supporting that child to be the best version of themselves. because I'm not going to get, otherwise you can have conversations that get embroiled in that person, that person's child. And obviously there's might be conversations around bullying. I get those ones, but even then, well, let's come back to the child and, what are we going to do right now in this space and time and moving forward to help that child?
Yep. Thanks a million, Adrian. Sarah, for you, is it very different? Is it very similar to what Adrian describes? How do you?
I think it's quite similar to what Adrian described, to be honest, and what I similar to what I kind of said before, in the fact that I think if you keep the child at the forefront and what you want as the outcome, and you kind of have a positive mindset of outcome, and this is what we need for the child as the end goal of the meeting, you generally get quite a positive outcome from the parent. I think it is about framing the conversation, and I always use kind of like the burger analogy. So if you've got something that is negative, so for example, biting or hitting or bullying, try and frame it in a way where you say something really positive about the child, and you say about their positive attributes. So they might be really good at sharing some of the toys, or they might be really good at their handwriting, or they might be really good at phonics and reading. Then you can bring in, well, actually, we've noticed that they're doing A or B. Like, are they doing these things at home? How are you working on it if they have? If they've not, then these are the things that we've noticed. This is how we're addressing it. Is that something you're happy to take on board? If not, okay, well, we need to then look into this further. If they are, great, you can then move on and finish the conversation. I think, like Adrian said, a lot of the time parents like to compare their child, and they like to compare to other children. They get, oh, but they're not doing that, or they don't get that, or this child got this, but my child didn't. And again, it's about bringing them back to their child and going, I'm not going to discuss another child with you. I'm here to discuss your child. And you can be very open and say that, and as long as you say it in a professional way, you do have that right, but also you're not going to talk about any other child with another parent. That's not your job. That's not your right. And that's not that other parent's right to have that knowledge of that child. Especially if it's a child with SEND or a child that's got additional needs. Like, there should be no reason to disclose any other information. So you are well within your right to say, actually, I'm not going to have that conversation with you. We're gonna pause if that parent is insistent. And I think if you've got a tricky conversation, ask us, and it's the first time you've dealt with it, ask a senior leader to come in. If you have parents that are going to be tricky, so there's always parents in every year group that we always kind of tag team up our teachers so we can support them with that, so that they've got a model of a conversation, because it can be quite daunting. But I think you as a teacher need to have that ownership and that positiveness of actually, like, I can say this, and as long as you say it in a professional way and it's backed up with the policy, they can't really say anything else.
Yeah, really helpful.
So it's like, I know, but there's a couple of questions that have come up which I think are pertinent to what we've been talking about. So there's one about parents being entitled who keep complaining, and that it comes to a point where staff are anxious about even disciplining a child through fear of the parent's response. My response to that is, firstly, as a school, you've got your standards and your expectations, and ultimately we're trying to prepare young people at whatever stage they are for future adulthood, which has certain expectations and consistencies. So with that, you have to follow not necessarily your behavior policy, but follow your expectation. If a child is not following your expectations and you have certain sanctions or whatever is in place, or positive framing or whatever it is, you need to follow that and not allow your staff to be fearful of what comes from parents. Ultimately, parents have a choice, and they may feel entitled, or whatever you want to call it, but ultimately have a choice. If their parent are that upset with the school, that they don't like the school, there are other schools to send your child. And that's a conversation that I do sometimes have with parents, because it's not because it's clear off. Actually, we want your child to be, and we want your child to be part, because we want to grow and develop your child into be a highly functioning adult. But what we can't have is your child not following what we're doing to try and help them, and you endorsing that. Well, then therefore it's not going to work. And that's part of some of those difficult conversations. And I think that is really important as leaders and as all staff, that where John has always talked about that consistency and that support. If staff know that they are going to be supported from us as leaders, then I would back them to do whatever is necessary in a positive way, or in a way that's actually involves some kind of intervention. I back my staff to do that.
I think this is such an important point because we have seen a really big increase in vexatious complaints and the volume of complaining from parents. And it doesn't have to be every parent, of course, it can just be one parent in a setting, and that's enough to create quite a big fallout. So interesting, Adrian, your very clear boundary there, which I think from the work that we've done and the conversations I've had, it doesn't work well to try and, I'm going to use the word pander to behavior from parents that feels intimidating. That doesn't seem to ever end well because there's no limit to how far that goes. So ultimately, there is kind of a reckoning. So really appreciate your kind of straightforwardness on that. I want to bring John in to just talk about this other question a colleague has posted around the difficulty in reaching parents. Some parents just don't respond when school reaches out and tries to make a relationship with them and connect. And so the colleague has asked, if that's the case, what advice do you have in that scenario? And just while you think about that, John, I'm going to also remind colleagues on the call, it's lovely to see some questions coming in. Please do post them because this is the moment to get some of these things answered. John, to you, when parents aren't responding to invitations to speak, how do you engage with that?
Sorry, I forgot I was muted there for a second. Literally, I'm just in the background saying, yes, absolutely. I agree with everything that's been said, because it's such a poignant conversation. This is very, very interesting for me because this is something that my school is currently going through, in terms of disengaging parents. How can we reach them? And there's various ways, I would say the least. That you could have an individual that is known as a family liaison officer whose sole job is to really make sure that there's those positive relationship with family. And what I really want to stress on, and Adrian did talk about this earlier, is that right now we are having a generation where, and so weird me saying that because I'm literally young myself, but we have a generation where people have kind of gone through school, had negative experiences, and now they're having children themselves and they're passing on that inherited almost discomfort towards school as an institution. And so, as leaders, we need to make sure that and I know it's another thing that we're adding to our list, but we have to meet parents where they are. And so, what that could potentially look like is, rather than enforcing parents to come in, and I do absolutely believe in that. I'm very hard on that stance. Sometimes you may need to make an inclusive practice in the sense that you go to their homes, do a home visit, you actually do a phone call, you do a Teams conversation. But one of the things I've introduced at my school is that, and I lead on Key Stage 3, is that in every single year I've identified the top 15 most complex, challenging individuals. And on this form that we've created, I've asked their heads of years to identify the one trusted adult that is going to be the connection between home and school. So for those 15 individuals, that one person will be the medium that they'll be communicating good news. And I reference good news first because that is the most important one. And then the negative ones as well. Because what we often need to identify is that when teachers are reaching home to disengaged parents, is that you're not the only teacher, right? Especially from a secondary school context. That parent could be having 10 different negative calls per day. Multiply that by 5, and they're tired. They're absolutely tired and frustrated. And so you really need to streamline the individuals who are working or in order to get through to the parents. And actually do let parents know that this is something that we are doing to support your child. But I'd say the last thing as well is that sometimes you do have to go down the policy. And at my school, if a parent do miss meetings, for example, that goes down on the child's file as a missed parental letter. And then at least that's evidence in the sense that we've tried to engage them. And then that's evidence that you can use if you need to take it to the next step, which it could be to involve external services like early help or social care.
So when you feel like this child really is isolated and then your very best endeavors aren't connecting, then you've got to step beyond and go
Yeah.
and go and look for additional help. Really helpful. Sarah, I'm going to come to you in a minute and ask you to comment if you have anything to add on Alex's post in the chat. But John Oy, while you're there, I want to come back to another one of the questions we've been asked, which is about so the colleague says, we talk lots about equality and equity, and most children are kind of fine with that, but not everybody is. How do you have a conversation with parents when that's not evident, when the child isn't behaving in line with the overall values of the school or the setting for around equality and equity? How do we talk to parents in that scenario?
Um, so I was just trying to find that question. I'm assuming that's inside the box. That's
It's
not.
in the Q&A box,
Okay,
and
that's fine. That's fine. 'Cause I was really trying to understand it. Can you just repeat it a second?
so the colleague has said that we talk a lot about equality and equity, and most of our children are engaged in that, but
Mhm.
some aren't. And then we have to talk to parents about it who are not supportive of an equality and an equity ethos.
Got
How
you.
do we approach that conversation with the parents?
Mhm. Well, number one, I think all form of conversation with parents, the child should always wait outside first and foremost. And that's just practice that we train our staff here at, because it's quite important that you get the parents, not necessarily to agree with you, but to understand the line that the school's going to go down. And they need to be in agreement with the line in where the school stance is. And when you do end up bringing the child in, then we're just going to have to trust the parent to echo where we currently stand. So I think, I guess a good practice is that have this conversation and you need to hold them to account, but don't have the conversation in front of the child because you're ultimately battling two people. The second thing I'll say is that before you stands a grown adult, a grown adult. So I don't know, there's only so much learning that you can give within a 15-20 minute meeting. You're going to just have to explain this is our policy. And that is such a powerful phrase. This is our policy. This is where we stand. Um, if you are in disagreement with it, by all means, we will happily support or find another placement for your child. And that is in the most utmost respect. But this is where we stand because we safeguard everybody to make sure that they feel inclusive. And I think it's just being very clear with where you stand as a school, and be confident with that.
Nice. Because
Yeah, I'm a
again,
bit
it's
passionate about that one because I've had to do it. That's
yeah,
a
I wondered if that might resonate. And I think there's again, it reminds me of Adrian's remarks earlier. There's a real simplicity and authenticity in what you describe, which actually makes it very simple. It's not a complicated point at all. Really nice and a lot for us to take from that. Thank you. Um, Sarah, I'm going to come to you on Alex's remarks, which I've now managed to lose. Here we go. But about online messages and kind of aggressive blaming correspondence. I mean, in my kids' schools, the WhatsApp groups for parents I can't be in them anymore, to be honest. But there is a tone that can be used online that's really difficult. Do you have any reflections on that?
Yeah, I have definitely had my fair share. I know my team have here. And it's a caveat because on one hand it is really good because you can message parents straight away, you can do the translation. It works really well for engaging with parents who aren't necessarily at the front of like always coming to pick up and things. We have lots of children that go to breakfast club and after school clubs. We don't see their parents. On the other side of that, it does lend itself very well to parents being able to access you at all hours, sending rather not very nice messages, and things like that. And as Alex has put in the chat, X says she's shouting a lesson, is very upset when this could be farther from the truth. I'm sure it is further, like nothing, that is not the truth at all, what that parent has said. And actually, it is really hard as a teacher to hear that. When we get messages like that, I often firstly say to the staff, one, it's not you, it's the parent. Two, that child has perceived something. It might just be that they overheard something or they thought of something, or actually the way that they have seen it, they've just taken it out of context. So also bear that in mind. And three, I say, don't reply to it. Either phone the parent or invite the parent in, because by you engaging in the conversation and replying to it, you're just going to inflame it, and you're going to give the parent more opportunity to reply and show them that that's what you're going to do. And by constantly engaging with a back and forth conversation about that, you're just going to keep giving the parent that opportunity to have those conversations and those digs and things, and that's not okay. Because nobody should be asked that. It's different when it's face to face, and absolutely, I have had parents come to me and go, "Oh, so and so said that this happened yesterday," and I'm like, "Actually, X, Y, and Z was happening. We had two children that were really upset. One child hit another child. This had also happened. So at the time, there was a lot going on, and X bit happened. So this did happen, but it happened in this context, and the way it was relayed to you wasn't what you thought it was. And you can de-escalate the situation a lot better in person. With things like Dojo and online chats, you can turn the notifications off on your mobiles and things. So if people do have them on their phones, which I would suggest you don't, I don't, and I do tell my staff not to, you can turn the notifications off. You can kind of turn it off so it's only on at certain times of the day and things. And you can also turn your read receipts off, which I think is really good, because it means you can read a message and the parents don't know you've read the message. So you can leave it on read for as long as you like, you read it, but it means actually you can process it and have time. You can share it with a member of your SLT, but you've not got a parent knocking at your door saying, "You've read my message, what's happening?" It gives you that breathing space. And sometimes you do need that breathing space to think about, because nobody should be getting those passive aggressive messages. It's not fair. And our job is hard enough as it is. Hopefully that answers your question.
Some generally good advice about social media there. John, in a minute, I'm going to come back to you just on this point around when we're trying to offer further support for kids and the parents aren't engaging. It's not necessarily a behaviour issue, but people are trying to offer good, sensible support and resources, but they're not being picked up. How do we deal with that with parents? But Adrian, first, let me just ask you the question Angelina's posted. So having a community where there's a lot of mental health issues, and front of house staff, receptionists, caretakers, whoever's on the gate, presumably bearing the brunt of anger or aggression from parents in that situation. And I guess there's going to be a kind of, well, you can have a policy perspective, but in the moment, how do you support your staff who are there, and what do they need and what do they have?
I think the key thing with all of these things is you never meet anger with anger. Invariably, when you're working in certain communities, I'm not saying you expect that, but I grew up in East London, and the local context can feed into even more so people having mental health. And all walks of life, people have mental health issues. But when you're addressing parents who have mental health issues, but as with everything, is to remain calm, arrange a time to talk where there's not a capital illness, or take them in the school and pass it on to a member of staff who, if you're not equipped to address it in the moment, they will be, because if it's after school on duty, there's always someone available. For example, my SLT meetings are never immediately after school. They're way after school to give time where people are available, and there's always presence. So if that member of staff in the moment can't do it, we always encourage people to do things in a calm manner. We are not a shouting school in any way, shape, or form. So things dealt with a calm manner. When they've got mental health issues, the key thing is to try and find an opportunity to take that parent away from the immediacy of everything that's going on around them, and either promise to pass it on to someone else, or have someone else address them, or address it in the moment. Ultimately, where people have mental health or not, people care about their children, and you can't just wander past parents with mental health issues. But what you can do is have the initial conversation, and then there's different levels of support you can offer that, whether it's early help or all those kind of things that you have as a school at your disposal that you can do to help and support the school, whether it's through strengthening families work or whatever that. But in that particular moment, you have to remain calm. And then if you don't feel equipped as a member of staff to handle that, because dealing with those kind of situations, not everyone will feel comfortable doing that, but pass it on, or know that there is someone in the school who is available to do that, and promise to pass it on that moment. Because what you can't do is panic. There's always knowing if you're part of a team, as the way I see the collective at my school, we are one team. there's always going to be someone, there will always be someone available to support and have that conversation. Of course, on the back of that, we do trauma-informed training and all those other things that we do, but which is to support parents and staff. So our staff are trained in that. But even with training that you have, when you're caught in a moment and you're caught off guard, not everyone's going to be equipped to do that, but know that there is someone who can.
So there's definitely a piece about providing training, but there's also the bit about making sure that there are plenty of other staff around who can be called on, or maybe it's not even that they're around, but that the frontline staff know that they're welcome to call colleagues, and that's a way to deal with it. Really helpful. Thank you. John, are we back to this point of, let's say we have parents, there's not really a behaviour issue, but colleagues are trying to provide what they think is good additional support for students, and the parents are not engaging, or they don't seem to agree, they're not supporting the take up of whatever that provision is. And so you've got your teacher trying to make a difference here, and kind of getting silence on the other side. How do we go about trying to bridge that?
I would say it is a real good understand. There's a real good aspect of trying to understand where the parents are and as to why or where their opposition comes from with it. And I think if you were to understand that and really excavate that as an issue, you'll then be able to almost suggest the same solution. If it's a really good solution that you know will be very beneficial for the child, I I find it hard to believe any parent or carer who wouldn't at least give thought to that concept first. But you do need to create room and space for it. And part of that acceptance comes from the idea that it may not be you who's person to deliver that, but the actual child's trusted adult, where the parent has built a good and positive relationship. One of the things that we try to do at my school here, and we made sure that's the case for every year seven, is that every single one of them has a trusted adult, and this trusted adult at least calls home and makes some positive calls and build that rapport with at least every single one of our year sevens. And that's a habit that we're really trying to create, because it does make things a lot easier when it's time to have certain conversations that isn't necessarily only behavioral, but it also could be a case of support and just general observation as well. And I think it comes down to the school culture. If parents are really bought in to the fact that the school that my child goes to have their best interest at heart, it makes everything quite easy, or follow on from this quite easily.
It's quite interesting, that, isn't it? That the value you find in the trusted adult approach. I mean, it makes absolute sense. It's like account management in a business setting. But I guess if you're a member of staff and that's not an approach that's in your school, maybe there's an opportunity here to share the practice that you've heard. And there may be, clearly it's going to be difficult to do it for every one of 200 kids in a year, but John I's point about identifying kids for whom that may make the biggest difference, and looking at whether there's a possibility of taking some of that learning and trying it out in your setting might be a way forward.
Yeah.
Really, really valuable to hear that. I'm going to, in just a moment, I'm going to come to you all and ask you what's the one thing you really want people to take away from this. But before I do, I'm very struck by the compassion and the thoughtfulness, and the sort of constructiveness with which you have all approached this topic. So I'm going to be a less good individual, frankly. In my role as a school governor, I had a lot to do with parents, and there were times where I could caricature parents, and that may have included an eye roll on my part, and it may have included a bit of irritation and annoyance at some of the things that I saw as repeated patterns by parents. So for people like me who are less good than you, who slip into sometimes stereotyping the sorts of things that parents can do, wanting their own child to get the very best possible, or having no patience with the fact that such and such a teacher didn't do precisely the thing they wanted, or whatever it is. How do we stop ourselves doing that? How do we stop falling into that slightly, it might border on cynical at times if we're tired, but how do we stop ourselves stereotyping parents, and then by doing that actually nearly draw out the response that we feared? Is there a way of holding, how do you hold the integrity that you present here today? How do you hold that when you're tired and grumpy and you've had enough? Anyone of you?
I'll go first. Adrian, I saw you don't mean to yourself as well. Um, so I think for me as a teacher being in class, it's really about remembering those little positives that happen. So the day that that child remembers to do good sitting, or they remember they've got their pencil case, and just feeding that back to the parent, and just all those little things, those go a massively long way to building up that relationship with that parent, even if that parent is that parent, the one that you're like, oh, they're there again. Oh, they're speaking with the head teacher again. Oh, they're there knocking on the door again. Oh, they want to see me again. Even if they're that parent, the more compassion you show them and the more kind of kindness you show them, the more likely they are to take that step back and go, actually, yeah, you are thinking about my child.
Yeah.
And I think it is really difficult because you do get desensitized at times and you do think, oh, again, they're moaning, oh, okay, this is what we're gonna, those eye rolls come in and things. But it's
Mm.
about you as a team and senior leaders actually going, do you know what? These are things that are going to help us. These are things like we need to empower in parents, and these are what we need to do to support them and trying to reframe it, especially to
Lovely.
those parents.
Thank you, Sarah. Jono, you came off mute there. I don't know if you wanted to add anything, or Adrian, if there was anything additional either of you wanted to say about how you hold yourself in a kind of positive space and don't fall into the habit of kind of caricaturing somebody. Is there anything else you would add on that?
Yeah, I was getting ready for my final point. It was going in my head, but I think one of the things that I really try to do is allow the people who I work with to hold me to account. And so oftentimes I go to them and I say, all right, I have this parent, this is what I said, and critique that, and I think what that does is that does keep me grounded in the sense that, okay, Janoi, you've missed the point in terms of this aspect, and then hold true to the nature. As educators, we need to be reflective, and that is not just with pedagogy, but that's also even with your interactions. That could be with a young person, and it could be with a parent as well. So I open
Lovely.
myself up to be held accountable.
I mean, I think the openness that goes into that is just such a fantastic place from which to be a professional. The learning that goes with that. So I have a lot of
Yeah.
admiration there. Janoi, as long as you've got the mic, do you want to give me your last pearl of wisdom?
Yeah. I was just writing this down as well. I think building better parent-teacher relationships starts off with a shared mindset. And this shared mindset is the case that I'm not just an educator, you're not their parent or carer, but in aspect, we're both co-architects of a child's future. And if we're both trying to realize and we're trying to form the best version of that child, there has to be certain common language, clear communication. We need to have strong and effective, not always positive, but effective boundaries, and mutual respect. But it all stems down to this whole idea that we're both co-architects of the child that we see in front of us.
That's a lovely metaphor. Thank you, sir. Sarah, what was your final parting point you want people to take away with them?
Um, so I think going back to what you just said about being able to caricature parents and that kind of feeling, I think it's really important that we do still that parents will feel welcomed. And I think it's that kind of openness of yes, we have an open door policy, but you make an appointment to come and see me. Like if you have something to discuss, like absolutely yes, I'm here for you to chat to, but we're going to frame it in a positive way and welcoming those parents in when they need to talk, but also having those boundaries for yourself because you are parent facing in this role. It is something that we have to deal with every day. It's never going to change. And yes, COVID has kind of brought the line through to say, oh, we're not having you over the threshold anymore. Oh, we're not there. But actually, that's almost done as a disservice and a hindrance because parents don't feel that they can come to us anymore. And parents do need that support still. So by welcoming them in and having that open door where you can say, yeah, sure, come and book an appointment to see me, come and have a parent surgery. How can I help? What are you really enjoying right now? What's working well? What would you like to see us do better? Or what would you like us to do better for your child?
Yep.
Is a really positive way to move forward.
Great. I'm just going to make a brief announcement to my colleague Jen. Jen, if there's anything you want in terms of feedback from participants, whack it in the chat now. And then I'm going to give the last word, Adrian, to you. What's the thing you want people to take away?
I think the ultimate thing I want people to take away is, as educators, we are accountable, and we hold our, as John said, we hold ourselves to account. So we have one of the most important jobs in the world, as well as being, I mean, I'm, being a parent myself, but as teachers and educators of young people, it's one of the most important jobs in the world. And part of that job is to engage with parents, is to support and challenge parents for their children to be the best version of themselves in that space and time. And that's something that we won't forget, but we do that with humility and we do it with transparency. When we do things, when we do things, and sometimes as teachers we get things wrong, we don't try and hide and disguise that. But what we do, we work really hard and know that the reason why we come into the building is for those children, and therefore we have to work just as hard with the parents as do with the children to ensure that they get the best deal. And sometimes we understand that that may not always be pleasing to parents, but we hold on to the fact that we're doing the right thing and we're doing it in a manner that is professional.
Listen, I found this session really inspiring, actually, and very moving. I think that the amount of thought that goes into parent relationships and the amount of care that you all professionally hold is just, it is moving. And I hope colleagues on the call have found there's been also a lot of practicality talked about here. So I hope colleagues on the call have found that helpful and useful.